So yeah, what I wanted to kind of go over with you what we'll be looking at, and we wanted for the learning objectives for both barrier-free and for our RAS license. We're going to be speaking about some things on the outside, and we're going to be looking at things on the inside. So one of the first things that we want to mention is this is what we call an alteration. Right? It was a remodel, therefore the alteration definition by the Texas Accessibility Standards. And it's a primary function. So the space was remodeled, and the space that was remodeled is considered a primary function. Therefore, it wasn't just the scope of the architects that had to be in compliance. So all the things that we're going to be seeing that are new, like the butterfly house and the all the things that were newly done on the upstairs, all had to be compliant because they're new construction. But we also had what we call the Magic 5. The parking that serves the butterfly house and the altered area, the accessible route from the parking to the entrance, and the restrooms and drinking fountains and public telephones if there's any. But those are the things that had to comply even though they weren't required, but they weren't part of the scope of the architect's job, right? So that's actually something that sometimes is confusing. And then also, the entire building didn't need to be brought up to compliance, so the ballroom that wasn't touched, that was existing and wasn't remodeled and wasn't part of the alteration, is not accessible. It is accessible via a ramp that they created, and that's compliant, but the stage inside wasn't touched and it's not compliant. So, but that wasn't required to be. The ADA now, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a civil rights law, does require that every time there's construction, or every time that there's a remodel, that a little bit of the building gets upgraded as much as they can. And they have like what they call the 20% rule, which means, you know, they'll allow you to go up to 20% of your budget should be for upgrades to the ADA. And so that's different than in Texas. And Texas doesn't require that. The Texas only requires those 5 things that I mentioned. So that's why the ballroom wasn't really part of the inspection and part of what we looked at when we were inspecting. So what I'm going to take you to the parking. So I want you to follow me, and I'm going to take you to 2 parking spaces. There's 2 parking lots. There's one on this side of the fairgrounds that's not compliant. I want to show you that one because that was exactly the way the one that is compliant currently was, and I want to show you why it wasn't compliant so you can see. And then I'm going to take you to, after I flagged it as a violation, the city actually fixed it, the one that serves this building. And they did a good job. And so I'm going to take you to the newly fixed parking, and then I'm going to bring you back to the lobby. So if you guys want. So if you notice the parking, it's one right after the other. You see that? There's maybe an access aisle here, but pretty much all the parking spaces are right next to each other. And the only way to get to the program is for this person to wheel their wheelchair behind the other people's cars. In the ADA, this is allowed, actually. The ADA doesn't have any requirements for any what they call vehicular hazards. That's only in Texas. In Texas, they want you to have an accessible route to the ramp in front of your parking spaces as opposed to behind the parking spaces. So this one was, and if you notice the signage has to be one for every parking space, has to have signage. And also, if you notice, the access aisles are only 5 feet. They're one for every 8. I know it's a lot of little things, right? This is 5 feet both. One for every 8 parking spaces needs to be what they call van accessible. And a van accessible needs to have an 8-foot wide access aisle. So there's lots of violations in this parking lot. Now I'm going to take you, I'm not even going to measure the curb ramps, but the curb ramps, well, I am. Let me go ahead and take you and show you all the other ones. So as you're going to the accessible route, this is the way a person in a wheelchair would go to the Texas Discovery Garden. Dale? And there's two things going on with curb ramps. So besides the fact that it's wide enough, I can see that. There needs to be contrasting color from the adjacent surface. And right now it's the same color as the adjacent surface, so that's a violation. And then I'm going to show you that I haven't measured this one. This one's actually okay. This one's okay. 7.3% is an acceptable slope. So this curb ramp was acceptable enough, and this has to be, it has to be 8.3% for it to be compliant. And then this has to be 10%. So this is an acceptable sloped curb ramp and width-wise, but it doesn't have the contrasting color, and it does have the texture acceptable currently by the Texas accessibility standards. They do recommend that you use truncated domes because that's currently what's the only texture required for it.
Now, is the truncated domes required or not? I've been getting,
Right.
I just got written up on several saying they're required.
Okay, so it is required. It's not required. It's highly recommended because it's the only texture that's written up in the ADA in the federal standards. Texas, in order for Texas to change their standards, they have to have literally an act of Congress for them to change it. So they decided to just submit a bulletin, a memo that says we highly recommend that you use truncated domes because that's really the federal standard. Even though the only requirement in Texas is for it to be felt underfoot, and whatever that means, because I can't feel this underfoot.
Marcela, you still are subject to the ADA.
Yes.
Yeah, are you,
Yes.
so would it not be required?
Right, so that's where the difference is. If I'm an inspector, but I'm only an inspector for the Texas accessibility standards.
Okay.
I'm not flagging you for the ADA. So by the ADA standards, the 1991 standards, this doesn't comply. Now, the new ADA is taking the texture away completely, so there's no.
But it will be under the Department of Transportation.
Right,
So
and that's
more complicated.
exactly. So curb ramps is a complicated subject. So in order to not confuse people in Texas, and I was only doing the inspection for this Texas accessibility standards. In Texas, this texture is acceptable, but they highly recommend to use a truncated dome, the full length and width of the curb ramp.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are you saying that, and I'm new to Texas, so
Yes.
it's totally confused to me.
Yeah, of course.
Texas, it sounds like, is maybe more restrictive, where you have some things that are
Different. So they're more restrictive in the parking. You notice how I said the ADA, that would be acceptable with the ADA, but not in Texas. They're not as restrictive with the texture. That's the only part of the Texas accessibility standards is equivalent, or they got an equivalency to meet the ADA. So if you do what it says in the Texas accessibility standards, you're basically meeting the requirements for ADA, except with the curb ramps. Curb ramps are the only thing that's less strict than the ADA, because the ADA
so
only.
then how can you do that? Don't you still have to meet ADA?
Yeah, that's right. So that's why you should just use truncated domes and call it a day. But some people don't want to do them. Some people don't want to do truncated domes because they don't have to, and that's why they did, because they don't have to in Texas, because they can do this.
You mean you're exempt from federal?
No, we're not exempt from federal, but nobody is. The Department of Justice, right? So the Department of Justice is the only one that can regulate the ADA. It's nowhere in our standards. So yes, that's the part of the accessibility standards that are confusing. Yes.
Some cities, though, however, are enforcing federal. So when you're designing, you've got to take into consideration your
Right.
municipality may be stricter than Texas.
Right, but then that's only if the inspector. So yeah, so really, when you're talking to a RAS, the only thing we have jurisdiction over is what the accessibility standards say in Texas. But if you're talking to the city official and they want you to do truncated domes, you have to do what they say. So that's the part. This is the one part that's very gray and confusing.
Well, one other thing.
Yeah.
Helpful thing for the architects in the audience. You're going to get sued if somebody drives by and sees that your curb ramp doesn't have truncated domes. So, and if you say that I said this, I will deny it. Put truncated domes, if the client insists that they don't want truncated domes, put them where they can be seen. So the drive-by lawsuits will be diminished. Reduce your risk.
And even to confuse things further, I don't want to confuse you any further, but there is a difference between what's inside the property line versus what's outside of the property line. In Texas it says if you have a curb ramp within your property line, you have to have the full length and width of the curb ramp with contrasting color and texture. If you have one outside of the property line in the public right-of-way, you're only required a 2-foot strip at the bottom of texture and contrasting color. So right. So just remember, within the property line, full length and width of the has to be.